So, yeah, thank you all for coming. It's a very special project, as I said yesterday, and I'm very happy to discuss it with you, and willing for more actually questions than me explaining everything and all the details. Basically, it's the idea started, my interest in this specific architectural location in Alexandria started in 2012, 2013, something like this. Before this, it was just some crazy kind of structures and buildings that we used to go to in the 80s and early 90s for summer vacations. Like, my family used to rent chalets and hotel rooms there, and this was like the middle class kind of summer destination. You don't need a car, you don't need anything, you just like take the normal transportation, go there, a little bit outside the city, quite stylish, and it's totally state-run. Of course, this kind of use and the clientele of the resort changed over time, and we've been witnessing, like my generation, we've been witnessing this change and interest towards different other kind of touristic locations in the city, but nobody actually questioned what happened, why the specific social class is not going there anymore, and there are other people are using the place, and why this actually place was built in the first place, and why they used a completely different architecture style that has nothing to do with the rest of the city, because the rest of the city is like completely different buildings and facing different kind of urban and architectural problems. At this moment, I started to think that I need to know why, and because we all have this memory, it's kind of like shared memory for a generation, but there was no kind of a deep discussion. Also, the fact that there's no information about this location specifically, there's no archives, you never know who built what. Because all the credits goes to basically the army or the regime, the military regime who commissioned this resort to be built. So all the credit goes there. So the army had an army of architects. They were commissioned to design state-run projects and buildings. But of course, they were having like their eyes open on what was happening in the architectural scene internationally. So they were having a strong interest in what is happening in the architectural projects in Brazil, for example, and Latin America. So there was like this kind of shared interest and knowledge. But seriously, for us, for people in my age, it was completely like a big gap of information, and this we had to work. Even like researchers and historians, they suffer a lot to articulate this context within the history of Egyptian architecture. Also, it's important to mention that I think my generation, we were born in a moment that is totally apolitical. Peace is the most important thing for the entire country, and there should not be any kind of confrontation or with the regime or the power or argumentation, because this will lead to a completely dramatic chaos for the place that we're sharing together. So for almost 30 years, that's what we've been listening to in schools and TV shows and books and stuff, that now this is a peacetime, and we have to just value peace, and we have to, just look for the future of the country, and because this is the only thing, until in 2011, things happened. And then, actually, the word revolution used to sound like a very old-fashioned kind of thing. It's very bizarre. Who can make a revolution now? And so basically, that's how the generation was raised up. Until something happened, and it was just like a slap on the face of everyone. And of course, we're not going through the details of this because this is not the case now, but I'm interested in this moment, which I call it a wake-up call, that started to, everyone started to recontextualize and rethink the relationship with the history of the country, the history of the regime that they've been, living with or enrolled with or rolled by. And this was the moment that I decided to unfold this kind of projects and think about it in a different way. Also, the city and this location especially is going through a completely different renovations, and it might vanish over like a year, and there's no documentation, there's no archive for it. So the use of photography here is very important for me as a tool of documenting what I've been witnessing or what I've been seeing in a way. So I wasn't really interested in photography as a form, as an artwork, as an art form, but it's kind of a strategy to document things before it vanished. And also the scale of the photographs, the size and everything is very much related to the kind of pictures we have in our photo albums, because there are a lot of family pictures that have been taken during summer vacations, exactly the same size, almost similar colors, in these spaces. So the way I wanted to document the spaces as well was pretty much influenced by this kind of photographs, because it was my first source material, basically. The research started with friends working on the modern Egyptian architecture, the history of modern Egyptian architecture, and also the very important source for these kind of works and researches is Egyptian cinema, because cinema, we had like a very big industry in cinema, and these films are archiving the kind of lifestyle and urban environment that the country had over the past decades, and you can see it in films more than in archives or any official kind of documents. So films as like fictional form is actually very archival in this context and very factual in terms of like the visual materiality of it. So within the research, I discovered that Yusuf Shaheen, who is a very prominent Egyptian filmmaker, had a film called A Man in My Life. And this film was the first 5 minutes of this film was shot in front of the very iconic building in this Marmora resort. And here in this mural, in this wall, you will see the screenshot on the iPad. That's the building I'm talking about. This is a scene, and it's basically a young architect freshly graduated from Alexandria University is trying to explain the beauty of this modernist building to his mom in order to convince her with his decision to leave her alone in Alexandria and go to Cairo to get trained under this famous architect who built this building. I was quite intrigued with the strategy that the filmmaker used in order to think about the building. I mean, this building was not even used yet. It was not officially opened, the place, but it was, in this film, used as a backdrop to circulate the ideologies that the film is trying to distribute. So this was an interesting moment, how even buildings can be used as objects in these kind of productions. Even the filmmaker didn't know who is the architect who built this, and he invented this fictional character who was a protagonist in the whole film to make like a flashback of the whole story based on his identity. And then the whole film goes into a completely different dimension, very melodramatic, but also talks heavily about social justice, which was mainly the main word or the main aim for every single national project that was happening in Egypt at this time. The fact that the country was enrolled by a king, there was a monarchy, and then there was a group of soldiers decided to take over the power from the king, and then they redistributed all the lands and everything. And the main thing for them was to have social justice and restructure the whole country and society on a socially equal kind of way. this was basically also my generation, where we were raised on the fact that the army are the people who are the only people who are able to distribute fairly these kind of treasures that we have. And but then what the wake-up call actually opened up another question, that it's not necessarily true that what we've been listening to for 30 years. So back to the research, I discovered that this film of Yusuf Shaheen was an adaptation for an American movie called Magnificent Obsession by Douglas Sirk. Also same story, it talks about social justice in a completely different way, in a completely different socio-political context in America in the 50s. Both films were very interested for me as artworks that tried to talk about justice at a time that there was like very heavily ideological, like the moment that these films were produced was very ideologically charged with socialism and justice, social justice and all these kind of things. And it was interesting for me how to see how the two films, two artworks, I would say them, managed to, or tried to articulate or translate these kind of ideologies in the films. Both films were basically based on a number of men. They were the main protagonists. Basically you have one protagonist, but also 3 other people. And all the men, they were using like certain professions, an architect, a doctor, and an artist. And for me it was interesting how also at this moment these kind of professions were perceived or considered in the collective perception. The man, always the artist, he's a man who can give advices to people, can change people's life over a glass of wine while he's talking to people, and the architect, he builds things, and the doctor can rescue people's life. And there was always a woman, in the two films there was always a woman, she's a victim of everything. So it was actually interesting for me how even like gender-wise, how the two stories were structured. And this basically, you can see here in the 3 murals with the text. And so I just tried to note the like particular moments in the two films that they were interested, and opened something in my head while I was working on the research. As you can see, it's quite multi-layered kind of piece, but it's was also quite complicated to put it together in one form, because there was also many other things that I didn't want to do before I knew what I actually wanted to do. So for example, things started with the fact that I wanted to document the location because I was worried. I didn't understand it, like architecturally, historically, everything, but also I was worried that it will vanish, and at the end I will have nothing. I'll just end up with nothing, and I will just say that here used to be a modernist architectural buildings, and we used to go there, and I didn't want this kind of nostalgia. So I started with documenting, collecting the pictures, but at the end I realized that the pictures as a material is completely problematic in my point of view, because it was, at some point, was basically like architectural porn. And this was something that I was not really interested in, and I wanted to go beyond it in a way that can open questions and not really deal with photographs as something in itself. The research continued, and there was like lots of questions and blocks and different problems. And then the idea of still life came to my head, which is basically manifested in these 3 murals. The fact that I trained as a painter, and I still think a lot about the painting process and the artist locking himself in his studio for days and weeks in order to finish a painting that is not necessarily important to anyone. This special process is very interesting for me emotionally, and the fact that the artist always needed to either have like a self, like for example, if we think about self-portraits, when the artists, they just turn their back to the world and just close the door of their studio, look at themselves in the mirror, and they create a great painting that can occupy big part of museums and history books. This is interesting for me, and how the artists can freeze things and put them in their studios and look at them or look at themselves for a very long time in order to create the work. Somehow I wanted to metaphorically translate this into the research material I was working with. So basically I made these setups where I put the research materials, the films, the images, and the notes I used to have in my notebooks together in a set of still life. Here it's presented in a mural kind of format because we're supposedly sitting in a memorial, and in memorials normally you have murals that maps the historical trajectory of the event that the site is commemorating. So here it's basically we're commemorating a research, an artistic process, basically with these kind of murals. The use of blue is quite important because it's, apart from the fact that it's a visual element and it's pretty much connected with the tiles and the Mediterranean location and the architecture and everything, but it's also has a lot to do with the virtuality of the image and the open-ended kind of space, because you know you have the green screen and the blue screen that they normally use in TV and cinema. It's a screen that gives you basically neutrality of the background, that you can just put anything on it. It's totally open-ended. I wanted to keep this somehow in the work, and also think about the fact that it's a research material that is trying to formulate itself in a form, but it also can go anywhere. So that's basically the murals, how the mural came. Since we're talking about the mural, I will continue talking about how the elements of the installation are structured. But please also ask questions if I don't make sense, and I think I don't make sense.
It makes sense, but I'm just wondering, these objects which were selected for the still lives, they are extremely seductive. I have the feeling that they have a certain story behind why they were selected.
The objects, the duck and the, yeah. Well, it's like if we go through the history of industrial design and you know the teapot, the Bauhaus thing, and this was not really kind of calculated in my head when I was selecting the objects. But of course, it has a lot to do with taste and visual language and formal relationship with these kind of objects. It's basically objects that I like to collect and put them in my studio. And I like to photograph. Seduction is a good word actually, because it's a kind of object that seduced me from the shop, from a second-hand shop that is owned by the Salvation Army in Norway, and it's all based on seduction. It seduced me. I just collected them, bought them, put them in my studio, and I thought that I might do something with them. But there's no specific conceptual reason for the selection, but it's all based on a formal kind of concern. And it's important actually to keep it as formal as possible, because this was the problem of the project actually for me, because I was confronted with lots of historical, political, nostalgia, modernism, all based on like just images, informations and stuff like this, but I didn't know how to make a form out of that, and I'm not interested at all to make a documentary piece about what Egyptian modernity used to look like, or judge the Egyptian modernity in a way in the work. I was interested to open up certain questions and to understand certain power structures in the work, but at the end I was willing to produce a form out of that. So I think the fact that I did this in the studio, it kind of unlocked this kind of equation, and the idea of the memorial started to come in my head as a form. And this helped me a lot to continue, honestly. So yeah, and the rest of the elements, basically, I was interested to create a space that can look like, not really, I have to say that it's pretty much inspired by the architecture of the Edith-Russ-Haus. When I came last year to see the space, it was very helpful for me to build up the whole thing based on that. So I wanted to make the room not really looking like a gallery, that's what people normally used to see here, but to create a space to transform it into more like a city hall or a memorial that commemorates something. Has this kind of national appearance, and this actually all the visual elements was inspired by other city halls and memorials I used to visit, and it left a certain impact in my head. The marble was initially supposed to be trompe-l'oeil, painted by hand by a painter to mimic the marble structure, and it was important for me to make sure that for everyone that it's not a real material, because marble is like very materialist, the most materialistic thing in any building. It's very expensive and very precious, and you don't need to do much. You just put it on the wall and just transform it into a very rich space. So I wanted to fake this materiality, and the idea of laboring and painting a fake wall of a fake rich wall, basically, was very important for me. But this didn't work out for like budget reasons and practicality. But so the other option was to make it like computer-generated images. It's completely fictional. It's all based on pixels. It's not a photograph of a real marble. It's just it's based on basically algorithm. This also has a lot to do with the kind of state, the governmental projects that has been built by Mubarak, basically for the 30 years I was, that he was running the country. Basically, the 30 years that I was living in Egypt. All the buildings, we have like a joke between us that we call this Mubarak marble, because all the train stations, all the post offices, public buildings, they were all covered with granite or marble. Of course, it's very expensive for a developing country. It's not, doesn't make sense, and sometimes it's also not really practical to use it in the streets while you have a lot of dust and people it gets slippery. So we were always wondering why, but of course it was an important thing for the state, for this regime, to show that the country is very rich, the country is very powerful with this material as the building material. So it always gives me a certain generation, a certain connotation in my head when I see it on top of buildings, which is the fake power, the fake richness of the state. This I wanted to translate here in the space, so that's why it's computer-generated images, and you can see it on the caption that it's 8 unique computer-generated images. The glass is also the same as a building material, coming from the same time in Egypt. The way I wanted to arrange I think I thought at the end that everything's too monumental, and there's no, how do you call it? There's no humbleness in the whole piece, and I needed this somehow. So that's why the images are arranged in a way that is kind of neat, but also random in the meantime. And for me, this was important because it's important not to build a real memorial with real material everywhere, but a memorial that is proposed or imagined or dreamed of, basically. A memorial that is still in the making, which is exactly why I wanted to make a memorial, because there is no, like especially my generation, we didn't experience memorials for things that we have experienced. All the memorials and everything that is, all the public monuments are basically for things that far from us, things that happened in 30s, 40s, but all the things that we experienced has not been discussed and judged or fixed in cases, in the judge, and make a memorial. Because at the end, when you see a memorial that commemorates something, it means that there was a huge discussion before this memorial got built, and there was a kind of a collective argument, and something got really fixed in the collective memory, and that's why the memorial was built. So it puts an end for a very long process. This we didn't experience in my case, in our case as a generation. So that's why it's been always a dream to think about what kind of memorials can be for the things that we personally experienced. So that's why it's the idea that it's still in the making, it's still growing up. There are still always spaces for things to be added on it is quite important conceptually. The main central piece is basically this, it's called abstracted commemoration for unknown things. And it's pretty much the material. Of course, if you look at the images, you will see that the material, there's a lot of similarity with it's quite heavily used in the resort. And it's very much connected to Egyptian modern architecture, Mediterranean architecture in the 60s, 50s. And it's basically, it's an abstract form that is quite inspired by the kind of public art projects that is erected by the state in public spaces in Egypt. That is always, it's not just a form, it's not just a decoration, it just says, it's like, it commemorates something very nationalistically big in the collective memory, but you don't really understand how this process of the translation from the event itself to the form, how did it happen? You just get confronted with a form which is very abstract and very quite allegorical. And it's been always, for me as an artist, it's been always the question how this translation happens between a very bloody, strong event to a very abstract form to just be erected in a public space, and this can just generate certain emotions in people's heads and hearts. Any more questions? Cool. And Szabolcs. Yes. Thank you.